Four children. One quiet Sunday morning. A disappearance that shattered an entire town. What began as a peaceful day inside a small church turned into one of the most chilling mysteries of the 20th century, twisting through decades of secrets, shattered families, and a truth darker than anyone ever imagined. You won't believe what finally came to light. Stay with us till the very end. And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime and thrillers, haunting mysteries, and stories that refuse to stay buried. On a damp Sunday morning in the small town of Belhaven, West Virginia, the fog clung to the skin like breath on a mirror. July 1st, 1956. The air was still, yet the clouds hung thick above the steeple of St. Martin's Chapel, smothering the sky in a shroud of gray. The bells tolled at precisely 9 a.m., echoing through the valley and stirring birds from the elm trees that lined the old cemetery behind the church. The congregation began to arrive in ones and twos, umbrellas tucked beneath arms, their footsteps muffled by the wet gravel. Inside the chapel, it smelled of damp wood, candle wax, and a faint trace of incense. Reverend Elias Monroe stood at the altar, flipping through his sermon notes as the pews filled slowly. Among the congregation that morning were four children who had come together, as they did most Sundays. Catherine Cat Holloway, age 9, her younger brother Joseph Holloway, age 5, and the Barlow twins, Mary and Samuel, both 7. Their families were close, bound by the kind of small-town history that layered like rings on an old tree trunk. Years of shared holidays, tragedies, school functions, and church picnics. The children sat in the third pew from the front, swinging their legs quietly, their clothes crisp and clean. Catherine wore a pale yellow dress, her light brown curls pulled back with a white bow. Joseph fidgeted beside her, cheeks flushed with restlessness. Mary Barlow clutched a worn hymn book, and Samuel sat like a statue, as if trying hard to behave for once. No one knew that within an hour, all four of them would be gone, vanished into the folds of history without a single sound or scream. Service had begun. The choir sang hymns that trembled in the vaulted ceilings, and the parishioners dutifully repeated prayers. A few mothers glanced back now and then at the children, who remained unusually quiet. At exactly 9:47 a.m., during the reading of Corinthians, a strange flickering occurred with the lights, an anomaly for a building that didn't even rely on electric lighting at that hour. Candles along the altar fluttered violently, and one abruptly extinguished itself. Reverend Monroe paused, frowning slightly, but continued as though nothing had happened. No one connected the flickering to what was already occurring in the back of the chapel. A woman seated in the fourth pew leaned forward slightly to whisper something to her husband, and when she glanced ahead again, the children were gone. All four of them. The pew was empty. At first, it didn't register. Perhaps they needed the bathroom. Maybe a parent had quietly led them out. But no one had moved. No one had noticed. Not a single door had opened or closed. The service continued for another 20 minutes before a subtle panic began to spread, starting with Catherine and Joseph's mother, Eleanor Holloway. By the time the final hymn ended, Eleanor was already up, scanning the pews, her hands shaking as she pushed past a row of elders and hurried toward the narthex. "Cat," she called. "Joey." Her voice cracked against the walls, then disappeared down the hallway. Seconds later, she was followed by the Barlows. More voices joined. Questions, confusion. Reverend Monroe trying to maintain calm, but soon the chapel was in chaos. The children were nowhere. Not in the bathroom. Not outside. Not hiding beneath the pews or in the coat closet. The doors had been closed the entire time. Windows locked. There was no sign of them. No screams, no crying, not even a shoe left behind. By noon, the police were called. Belhaven had never seen anything like it. Sheriff Don Wexler, a grizzled man with thinning gray hair and a permanent frown, arrived at the chapel with 2 deputies and immediately cordoned off the building. Parents were asked to stay put. Questions were asked, statements taken. A team of volunteers formed within the hour, spreading through the cemetery and into the woods behind the church. They searched until nightfall. Every inch. Dogs were brought in from the next county. Bloodhounds picked up nothing. No scent trails, no disturbance in the underbrush. It was as though the children had never been there. The town spiraled into panic. Belhaven was small, barely 2,000 people, and everyone knew everyone. The idea that 4 children could simply vanish during a church service seemed impossible. And yet, here they were. 4 names printed on posters that began appearing on shop windows and telephone poles the next morning. Faces beaming from photographs taken in better days. Missing, they read in bold black type. Any information, contact Belhaven Police. Eleanor Holloway collapsed that night. Her husband David stayed awake until dawn, wandering the woods with a flashlight, screaming his children's names until his voice gave out. Margaret and Hank Barlow refused to go home. They camped in their car outside the church for 3 nights straight, hoping, praying that somehow the children would wander back. But they never did. For weeks, the search consumed every man and woman in Belhaven. Police interviews, search grids, town hall meetings. Volunteers came in from Charleston. Even a few FBI agents arrived briefly, combing the town for clues. But none came. There were no witnesses, no ransom notes, no signs of forced entry or struggle. Not even a footprint in the wrong place. The most troubling detail remained. No one had seen the children leave. In fact, no one remembered turning away. It was like a lapse in memory had infected the whole room. Time passed. By August, the flyers were faded. By September, theories were all the townsfolk had. Some believed it had been a coordinated kidnapping. Others whispered darker things, that the chapel was cursed or that some ancient evil had taken them. The Holloways and the Barlows clung to hope, but inside, something was fracturing. Eleanor stopped attending church. She withdrew completely, spending hours locked in the children's bedroom, whispering prayers into their pillows. David tried to hold the family together, but grief made a stranger of him. He lost his job, then his patience, and eventually his will. He stopped speaking altogether by winter. The Barlows fared no better. Margaret fell into depression. Hank began drinking. The twins' empty room remained untouched, beds made, toys undisturbed, a thin layer of dust growing on the windowsill. The years trudged forward, and the silence thickened. Rumors never ceased. Occasionally, a tip would resurface, a truck seen near the chapel, a stranger in town, but none led anywhere. Reverend Monroe retired quietly in 1958, citing stress and failing health. His replacement never quite filled the same space. And as the 1960s dawned, Belhaven grew quieter about the children. The story turned into folklore, a whispered warning to newcomers. Don't let your kids wander. Not here. Not after what happened. The Holloways divorced in 1961. David moved to Ohio, remarried. Eleanor stayed, but she was not the same woman. Her face bore the sharpness of sleepless years. She became a fixture on her porch, sitting motionless each evening, as if waiting for ghosts. Margaret Barlow died of pneumonia in early 1962. Her husband hung himself 3 months later in their garage. No note was found, just an old photograph of the twins clutched in his hand. By 1963, the children were declared legally dead. The pain never disappeared. It simply mutated, softened in places, hardened in others. Belhaven moved on. Stores changed hands, people passed away, children grew up and moved out. But something had remained behind, something unsaid, unfinished. The shadow of the children's disappearance lingered like mildew beneath fresh paint. Then, on October 29, 1962, 6 years and nearly 4 months after the Holloway and Barlow children had vanished, a construction crew working near the abandoned rectory behind St. Martin's Chapel uncovered something strange. It was just after noon when a worker's shovel struck something solid. At first, they thought it was a forgotten utility pipe, but then came the sound of hollow wood beneath earth. They unearthed an old hatch, a door of some kind, rotted but still intact, covered in roots and rusted hinges. It was locked with a bolt nailed shut from the outside. Authorities were called. Sheriff Wexler, now in his 70s but still serving in an honorary role, stood over the hatch with shaking hands. The lock was broken. The hatch creaked open. What lay beneath would unravel the truth everyone thought they knew. But not all truths offer peace. Some reopened wounds best left a scar. The hatch opened with a splintering moan, releasing a gust of air that reeked of damp soil, mildew, and something else. Something sour and old, like forgotten apples rotting in the dark. The sheriff and his deputies stood at the edge, flashlights trembling in their hands. The earth around the structure had begun to sink in places, forming a loose circle of decay that no one had noticed before. Beneath the hatch was a crude wooden staircase leading down into pitch blackness. The space hadn't been marked on any blueprints of the church grounds, and no local recalled its existence. Not even Reverend Monroe, who was now too feeble to speak much beyond mumbles. The police descended slowly, one by one, flashlights cutting weak beams into the dense underground. The steps groaned under their weight but held. At the bottom, they found themselves in a narrow corridor carved into the stone foundation of the chapel's old rectory. Walls were lined with wooden planks slick with condensation, and cobwebs danced like netting in the shafts of light. The tunnel bent sharply after 10 feet and then opened into a small chamber, no more than 15 feet across. It had no windows, no airflow, and no logical reason to exist. But what stunned them first was what hung from the ceiling. A collection of children's clothes, a pale yellow dress, a small blue jacket, a red sweater with a button missing, all of them suspended by thin wires like a grotesque mobile, turning slowly in the stagnant air. On the floor below, in the center of the room, was a circle of black ash. Symbols had been drawn into the dirt using chalk and charcoal, none of them identifiable, but distinctly intentional. In the far corner stood a child-sized desk, partially collapsed, with something carved into the surface so deeply the wood had splintered. The words were etched in jagged block letters. "We didn't leave." The chamber was sealed off immediately. A call was made to Charleston, and investigators from the state capitol arrived within hours. Forensics teams brought in ground-penetrating radar and began mapping out the space beneath the chapel. More discoveries followed. 2 adjoining tunnels that branched away from the chamber, each no more than 3 feet wide. They had to be crawled through on hands and knees. The walls bore scratches, claw marks, really, some only inches from the floor, as if made by small hands. In one tunnel, they found what remained of a notebook. Water-damaged, pages fused together, but legible in fragments. No name, no date, just childlike scrawls. "We can hear them upstairs. They don't see us. We try to scream. Time is gone. The dark is louder now." The discovery shattered what was left of Belhaven's composure. Eleanor Holloway was called to identify the dress and sweater. She did not speak for nearly 5 minutes after being shown the items. She simply stood, arms at her sides, tears falling onto her blouse. Then she nodded, just once. "They were here," she whispered. "The whole time, under our feet." The Barlows were long gone, but their surviving relatives were contacted. A cousin confirmed Mary's cardigan. Samuel's shoes were found days later, tucked behind a rotting crate near the back of the chamber. The town became a madhouse overnight. Reporters descended from all over, Charleston, Richmond, even as far as Baltimore. Satellite trucks parked outside the chapel like vultures, and the Holloway home was surrounded for 3 days straight. The mayor issued a formal request for privacy, but it was useless. Belhaven had become a tragedy with a face again, a mystery reborn. The most haunting detail was also the simplest. No bodies had been found. Only their clothing, their writing, their presence. Theories swirled. Had someone locked the children in that chamber? A cult? A member of the congregation? Was it an accident followed by a cover-up? Or something far darker, something not bound by earthly explanations? But the police were methodical. Wexler, against his better judgment, handed over the investigation to state authorities, who brought in psychologists, cult experts, even theologians. One discovery changed everything. A hidden trapdoor located beneath the pulpit of the old chapel, one that led directly to a vertical shaft, just wide enough for a child to slide through. It dropped straight into the underground corridor. The trapdoor had been covered for decades, by new flooring. There had been a way in, and someone had made sure it never had a way out. What came next fractured the town anew. Among the chapel's original blueprints, dated 1903, a signature was found. Architect Nathaniel Breyer, a name that stirred the memories of older residents. Breyer had been a devout churchgoer and theologian in the early 20th century, obsessed with Gnostic texts and holy isolation. He was known to write long treatises about the purity of children, the sanctity of silence, and the need to preserve light from the corrosion of the modern world. He had disappeared in 1929 under strange circumstances, his home abandoned overnight. Some believed he'd gone mad. Others thought he'd simply walked into the woods and never returned. The trapdoor, it seemed, had been part of a long-forgotten prayer chamber design, never sanctioned by the church and believed to have been removed during renovations in 1940. But somehow it had remained, hidden, sealed, waiting. The worst possibility began to sink in, that someone, maybe more than one person, had known it was there and had used it. One name came up again and again: Reverend Elias Monroe. He had presided over St. Martin's for 32 years, including during the children's disappearance. He had been respected, if a bit severe. Never married. No family. His sermons had once hinted at spiritual testing, divine trial, and the cleansing of the flesh. But no one had ever suspected him. Not seriously. Now it was too late to ask. Monroe had died in his sleep just 3 months before the hatch was discovered. In his attic, a single wooden box was found beneath insulation, tucked behind beams. Inside were dozens of pages, journal entries, letters never mailed, and sketches. Drawings of the chamber, of symbols matching those etched into the tunnel walls, of children, their mouths open, eyes blank. One page read, "They will thank me one day, when they see the world's filth and remember the silence we gave them." The public outcry was immediate. The church was closed. A memorial was held on November 12, 1962, attended by over 600 people. Candles were lit for Catherine, Joseph, Mary, and Samuel. A plaque was installed beneath the old bell tower, but the Holloways did not attend. Eleanor remained at home, blinds drawn, phone off the hook. She would never again step foot near St. Martin's. The investigation concluded on January 5, 1963. The official statement: no evidence of homicide. Cause of disappearance remains inconclusive. Foul play strongly suspected. Case remains open. But the town had made up its mind. Reverend Monroe had taken them, hid them, let them die in the dark. Some whispered that he believed it was a sacrifice. Others thought he simply lost his mind. But no one could explain how he'd done it. How he'd slipped 4 children from under everyone's eyes without a single soul noticing. Without a single sound. Unless, of course, they hadn't screamed. Unless they'd been told not to. Unless they'd trusted him. The tunnels were sealed with concrete that spring. The hatch filled in, the entrance buried beneath gravel and stone. The church was sold and converted into a historical landmark, though few came to visit. Eleanor Holloway moved away in 1964. Her home sold to strangers who never knew the story. She left behind the children's beds exactly as they had been. Sheets folded, toys on the shelves, a photo of all 4 children at the county fair, still framed on the wall. But one thing she took with her: a page from the damaged notebook, pressed between glass. The dark is louder now. She kept it by her bedside, because sometimes when she tried to sleep, she thought she heard voices in the walls. Soft, like echoes from underground. And she always listened, just in case they were still trying to come home. The spring of 1963 came and went, but Belhaven did not thaw. The discovery of the underground chamber had changed everything, but not in the way anyone hoped. Instead of closure, it deepened the town's collective unease. Questions continued to fester, unanswered and unwelcome. The newly poured concrete over the chapel tunnels sat like a scar, proof of a wound that had never fully healed, that now ran deeper than the graves behind the church. Most residents tried to move on. Stores reopened. Children played in the streets again, though always with someone watching. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, there was tension, a feeling that something unseen, still lingered. Some families moved away. Others, like the new occupants of the Holloway home, simply kept their heads down, ignoring the creaks in the floorboards or the unexplained cold spots in the children's old room. But not everyone could forget. Deputy Clara Raines had been new to the force in 1956. A fresh-faced 23-year-old with an oversized uniform and a keen sense of justice. By 1963, she was 30, worn thinner by time, her dark hair streaked prematurely gray. She had been there that day, July 1st. She had taken the early statements, held the weeping parents, sifted through the woods with trembling hands and a burning flashlight. And something had never stopped gnawing at her. It wasn't the symbols, the ashes, or the eerie writings in the chamber that haunted her most. It was a detail almost everyone had forgotten. A fifth child. Her name was Anna Lee Burroughs. 5 years old. Her family had lived on the outskirts of Belhaven, near the old mill. They attended St. Martin's irregularly. On the morning of July 1st, 1956, Anna had been at the service with her mother, seated in the last pew, close to the entrance. She wasn't friends with the Holloways or the Barlows, but she had been there, present, quiet, coloring in her lap with a pencil stub. And then, after the disappearance, she vanished from the narrative. Her name wasn't on the posters. Her family never spoke to the press. They left Belhaven just 3 days later without a word. The house was sold to a distant cousin, and no one ever heard from them again. Clara remembered Anna only because she'd seen her once afterward. 6 months later, just before Christmas of '56, Clara had been visiting a friend in Fayette County when she saw a child with dark auburn hair and large gray eyes sitting in the back of a grocery store, quietly stacking cans into a pyramid. The girl had a scar on her cheek, the same place Anna had a birthmark shaped like a teardrop. She locked eyes with Clara for a moment, and then the girl's mother swept her away. Clara hadn't reported it. She convinced herself she was wrong. A coincidence. A child who looked similar. But now, with the chamber discovered and the evidence of ritual and silence and secrets, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Anna Burroughs had known something. That maybe she hadn't just been a witness. Maybe she had been spared, or chosen. In July of 1963, Clara took a leave of absence from the sheriff's department. She told no one why. She packed a small suitcase, got into her green Mercury Monterey, and began driving east, toward Fayette County, toward the only memory that had never dulled. It took her a week to find them. Anna's mother, Margaret Burroughs, now remarried, was living under the name Margaret Dell in a small town called Clifton Forge, Virginia. The house was quiet, clean. A rose bush leaned too far over the front porch. When Clara knocked, the door opened just a sliver, and a woman's pale face peered out. "I'm sorry," Margaret said before Clara even spoke. "We don't talk about that." "I think you have to," Clara replied, "because I know your daughter was there that day, and I think she saw what happened." There was a long pause. Then the door opened wider. Anna was 16 now, still slight, still pale, still with eyes like gray marbles that seemed to see through people rather than at them. She greeted Clara politely, offering tea with a smile, too practiced for someone her age. They sat in the living room, sun filtering through lace curtains. Clara explained why she had come. Anna said nothing for a long time, just stared down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "They followed him." "Who?" "The Reverend. He used to take them down there, before the service. Told them it was a secret prayer room, that it was their special place." Clara froze. How long had this been happening? Weeks, maybe months. "I saw them go once. He had a key in his robe. I saw him lift the floor panel. But they didn't look scared. They were laughing, like it was a game." Anna swallowed hard. "But that day, he didn't come back." Clara's voice barely held. "And the children?" "They waited a long time. I was watching from the pew. They sat still for maybe 5 minutes. Then Kat got up. Then Joseph. Then the twins. One by one. They didn't say anything. Just walked. Not like they were being told. Like they just knew." "Knew what?" Anna looked up at her then, and there was something ancient in her eyes. That it was their turn. The rest came in fragments. That the Reverend had once told them about the thinning, a moment when the walls between heaven and earth became fragile. That the chapel had been built on such a place. That some children had the gift and could hear things others couldn't. Anna had never gone with them. Her mother forbade her from spending time alone with Reverend Monroe. She had obeyed, but she had watched. And when the children walked toward the pulpit that day, their steps had been perfectly in sync, like sleepwalkers. When the church noticed they were gone, Anna and her mother left quietly. Her mother feared blame, or worse, that Anna might be taken too. So they disappeared. "You could have helped us," Clara said, voice trembling. "You could have said something. We searched for years." "They would never have believed me," Anna replied. "And even if they did, I don't think it would have changed what happened." Clara left that day with a name, a place, and a terrible understanding. The children had not been abducted in the traditional sense. They had been groomed, lured, made complicit, not with threats, but with trust. Monroe had chosen them carefully. The chapel, the rituals, the chamber beneath it, all part of a system built on belief, obedience, and fear wrapped in holiness. A week later, Clara returned to Belhaven and requested the exhumation of the chapel's foundation. The request was denied. She resigned from the force the next day. Word of her visit to Clifton Forge eventually leaked. It made its way to Eleanor Holloway, who had, until then, never spoken publicly about her children since their disappearance. She requested to meet Clara in person. When they met, Eleanor listened without interrupting. She held the tattered notebook page in her hand the whole time. And when Clara finished, Eleanor asked only one question. "Do you think they're still alive?" Clara couldn't answer, because something inside her, some deep, cold thing, believed that maybe they were. Not alive in the way she knew, but not dead either. Hell, perhaps, trapped in some invisible place beneath time. A place where the walls were thin, where the dark was louder. A place Monroe had called holy. And maybe, just maybe, still listening, Eleanor never returned to West Virginia. But that fall, she began receiving letters. Anonymous, always typed, postmarked from cities up and down the East Coast. Each one contained only a single sentence. The first said, "We are not lost." The second, "We remember the light." The third arrived on Christmas Eve, 1963. It was never the end. She turned them over to no one. And every year after, on the anniversary of their disappearance, she waited by the mailbox, just in case they remembered. By the time the 20th anniversary of the children's disappearance approached in 1976, Belhaven had all but buried the memory. Most of the townspeople who had once filled the pews of St. Martin's Chapel had either died, moved, or remained tight-lipped behind heavy curtains. The chapel itself had been boarded up years earlier. No doors, no sediments. The town's children had grown up knowing only fragments of the story. Ghost tales whispered during sleepovers or scribbled in the margins of school notebooks. But Eleanor Holloway still remembered. Every second, she had kept every letter. 37 in total. Each one the same. A single line, typed, no return address. All in the same plain white envelope. After the first few years, she stopped showing them to anyone. Most people in Belhaven had long considered her a relic of grief, her tragedy embalmed by time, her sanity often whispered about with pity. But Eleanor was not insane. She was waiting. In May of 1976, a storm rolled through the valley, angry, sudden, and violent. Trees snapped, power lines whipped, and a mudslide cut off part of the hillside that bordered the back of the old chapel grounds. The next morning, a boy named Eric Granger, age 12, was walking his dog near the washed-out slope when he discovered something strange. A long section of rusted pipe jutting out from the exposed earth, surrounded by broken boards and what looked like the collapsed corner of an old stone wall. Thinking it might be treasure, or at least something worth poking, he climbed down. What he found was a second chamber. Authorities were called. This time, state police arrived armed with excavation crews, forensic teams, and historians. The structure beneath the slope was older than the rest of the chapel, predating the rectory itself. Stone foundation, timber beams blackened by age and moisture. The space had partially collapsed, but still intact within it were shelves, crude, child-height wooden shelves. On them were objects wrapped in muslin cloth. Dolls, toys, a harmonica, a stack of children's drawings, their crayon marks smeared by water and mold, and a mirror, 6 feet tall, covered by a white sheet so brittle it turned to dust when touched. Behind it was a frame of iron, forged into symbols now recognized by specialists as a fusion of Gnostic, Hermetic, and early Christian sigils, archaic, forbidden, long abandoned by organized religion. One of the investigators, a professor from Duke University, said the mirror was not ornamental. It was ritualistic, a portal perhaps, not in the literal sense, but one meant to reflect the self into submission. Inscribed along the frame in Latin were the words, Filii lux silentium, children of the silent light. The discovery made headlines again. Newspapers picked up the story from coast to coast. But it was what they found next that brought Belhaven to its knees. Inside the mirror's base, a hidden compartment. Within it, 6 sealed canisters of film reels. 8mm, each labeled by hand. 1955A, 1955B, 1956A, 1956B, 1956C, 1957, unmarked. The state released none of the footage publicly. Only 2 people were permitted to view it unedited, Sheriff Don Wexler, long retired, and Eleanor Holloway. The reels were shown in a private screening room at the Charleston Historical Archives on a rainy evening in June 1976. The projector clicked to life. The reels were silent, black and white. The first 3 reels showed children, Catherine, Joseph, Mary, and Samuel, sitting in a circle in the underground chamber, reading from books, writing in chalk, laughing. The Reverend appeared only once, his silhouette barely visible. But his voice could be seen guiding them, moving their hands, pointing toward the mirror. At times, the children looked directly at the camera. Not afraid, not upset, just empty. Reel 1956, C was different. It began with Catherine writing something on the wall, letters large and frantic. He promised us a door. Then a long, slow shot of the children standing before the mirror. They did not speak, did not blink. Behind them, the chalk sigils glowed faintly in the candlelight. Then, darkness. The last few seconds showed only the empty chamber. No children, no sound. The candles flickering, then dying. The 1957 reel was nearly blank. Static, lines. Then, just at the very end, a single frame. For children, sitting in a corner. Older, thinner, eyes wide. Catherine's mouth opened mid-sentence, but there was no sound. And then it cut out. Eleanor didn't cry. She simply placed her hand against the projection screen and whispered something no one else could hear. After the viewing, she asked to be left alone. She walked to the back of the archive building, sat in a wooden chair near the window, and stayed there for nearly 2 hours, staring out at the gray skies. She died in her sleep later that year. A note was found beneath her pillow. Typed, as always, "We're close now. Do not fear the mirror." In 1977, Sheriff Wexler, now in his 80s, gave his final interview. When asked if he believed the children were still alive, he said only, "No, but I believe they're still somewhere." The chamber was sealed again, this time with iron and cement, blessed by clergy and guarded by law. The mirror was placed in a private vault and forgotten by most. Years passed, but the letters did not stop. A journalist in 1983 reported receiving one. Same formatting. No name. The silence teaches. A historian in 1991 found one tucked inside an archive box at the University of Virginia. We never left the circle. And in 2002, a woman living in Minnesota, who had never heard of Belhaven, reported receiving a letter with only one line. "The dark is louder now." It was identical in tone, paper, and ink to those Eleanor had saved. The Holloway house still stands. The new owners sometimes complain of strange noises in the attic. Whispering, scratching, a smell like ash and old wax. They don't know the history. They don't know the names. But every so often, children walking past say they've seen someone watching them from the upstairs window. A girl, around 9 years old, hair tied with a white ribbon, smiling faintly, as if waiting